This is Akashvani. In the weekly program Current Affairs, now we bring to you a discussion on COP28 Ways to Mitigate Climate Change. The participants are Narendra Taneja, energy expert, Anil Triguniat, former diplomat, and Elizabeth Roche, associate professor.
Prime Minister Narendra Modi is currently in the United Arab Emirates, the UAE, for the 28th Conference of Parties or COP28 meeting. This is to discuss, of course, the climate crisis that we have on our hands. To discuss this subject, we have with us two eminent experts. One is Mr. Narendra Taneja, who is a well-known energy expert, and the second is Ambassador retired Anil Triguniat. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Mr. Taneja, if I could go with you first and ask Prime Minister at his third meeting of the Conference of Parties or COP conferences, he had gone for the Paris meeting, he was there at Glasgow, and now he is in Dubai for the COP28. Now, what I would like to ask you here is, earlier India was very diffident about its position when it came to climate crisis and the climate change issues. But now we are seeing a very much confident India at these summits. Would you like to trace for us the evolution of this path that India has taken?
You see, when you look at the history of COP, you mentioned Glasgow, before that Paris, and of course Sharm el-Sheikh, and now we are in Abu Dhabi. When you look at the history of it and the role of India and the issues and the points that India had been raising all along, of course, to protect our own interests, but at the same time to be a kind of voice of the global South and the fellow emerging economies, it has been very, very profound and very clear in the sense that India is, of course, with the world. We are on the same page as the developed countries or the so-called global South when it comes to the challenge of climate boiling or global warming, whatever you call it. At the same time, the message is that emerging economies, countries like India, we are entitled to, is our right to make sure that we don't compromise with our economic and industrial development and our mission to eradicate poverty, including energy poverty. So Prime Minister has been very, very clear on that. If you recall the meeting that the G7 meeting the Prime Minister addressed last year in Europe, he made it very clear and was talking more about how to eradicate energy poverty, and that there are 6.7 billion people in the global South. Many of them are still suffering from energy poverty, and therefore he also talked about climate justice. And that remains India's point. If you listen to the Prime Minister's speech now and along the way in other COP summits, as you mentioned, the trend is more or less the same. That's also India's stand when it comes to COP, and COP28 is no different. Although it's of course very interesting that COP28 is chaired by a person who is also chair of an oil company, and we all know the United Arab Emirates economy is basically an oil economy. And at the same time, when you look at the voices coming from the global north, that's very profound and focusing a lot on that how can we get rid of fossil fuels as soon as possible. But as far as India is concerned, and that's conveyed very powerfully, that we are with the world, but at the same time, when it comes to energy transition, it's going to be different for different geographies, it's going to be different in different countries. Therefore, basically, the entire journey, call it energy transition or by any other name, is going to be with the national characteristics in the case of India, with Indian characteristics and with our requirement. I think it's a very powerful message that Prime Minister has repeatedly conveyed, our officials have repeatedly conveyed. And the good thing is, by the time that we are in the UAE for COP28, and more countries, especially in the global north, are at least paying more attention to it. So I call it a progress. I think India's stand on this has been very clear. And when you look at the actual delivery also, the commitments we made, whether in Paris or in Glasgow or in Sharm el-Sheikh, we are among the top 5 countries which basically have delivered in terms of walking the talk. In fact, majority of developed countries are behind us in terms of delivering what they promised. But India, on the one hand, has walked the talk, deliver better than most developed countries, and at the same time, India has now emerged as the most powerful voice possible on this issue, whether it's COP or it's G20 or you go to any other platform.
Ambassador Triguniat, if I could bring you in here. When you talk about climate change today, it's listed on par with subjects like, or issues like, what's happening in the Middle East, what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, even the pandemic, the kind of impact the pandemic had on economies. We equate climate change to having almost as bad as an impact on global economies. So the whole narrative around climate change has changed, hasn't it? And it's very much central to the diplomacy that we see in the world today. Your comments on this?
In fact, if you come to think of it, the whether it was the pandemic, the Russia-Ukraine war, which are called as the Black Swan events, or now the ongoing Israel-Hamas war, very much at the heart of the West Asian crisis. They all have a terrible impact across the spectrum, and especially in the countries in the global south. We have seen that, and they have debilitated the economies. There have been the issues on the health, on energy, on high tech. So all these were very much there, and they were impacting us and impacting the world. So therefore, the India has taken up the cudgels on behalf of the world, becoming a voice of global south, trying to convey what are the real concerns of these countries for no fault of their own, which also Prime Minister today in his speech mentioned that it is just a few, as you in the beginning said, a few countries have done it and we are all paying for it, but nobody bothers about it. And the commitments have been essentially given by various countries and they have reached on them time and again. And so financing is an extremely important aspect of this. Now, very few countries come forth. This $100 billion target has not been met as yet. Despite from COP15 to COP28, we are here. These wars and these Black Swan events have in fact relegated various important priorities, whether it is climate change or SDGs or even fighting terrorism, to the back burner. And nobody was bothered about them. It is under their G20 presidency that India brought back those issues on the table and became a voice for these bigger issues. Not only that, in the larger context, in the 2015 at the Paris meet, India had launched the International Solar Alliance. Thereafter, the CDRI. And then you have now the Global Biofuel Alliance. Now, these are the global initiatives to have the global solidarity because this is a global problem. And therefore, the climate change, which is an existential threat, can only be met. And that's what Prime Minister has been telling. On the other hand, what we are trying to tell the world is something that we are already implementing in India. So the voice of India becomes far more credible in that sense that you are already doing those things, which we are talking about at the largest scale, while with 17% of the global population, your contribution for the global carbons is merely 4% or much less than that. So not only that you are undertaking the global responsibility to a greater extent, you are not using the global finance to combat that. It is all being done from within the resources. As just about an hour back, the finance minister mentioned that most of our challenges that we have faced with regard to climate change, all the actions have been met by our own resources. So India is doing that, not only doing that, but is also providing other countries the assistance in this regard. Now, it has been mentioned by Prime Minister, and I'm not going to repeat that we have not only undertaking to come to the net zero target by 2070, even much before that, I'm quite sure. But on the renewable fronts, renewable energy, it is the target of 500 gigawatt. It's not a mean target. And to bring about the fuel global, these non-renewable energies, non-fossil fuels usage to more than 45% by 2030 is another major thing that India is working towards. So, but one thing is there, no country is an island. Every country, whatever it does, has an impact on the other country. And it is far more evident today when on a daily basis we are seeing the deteriorating climate conditions. And therefore it is imperative that the world gets together and understands, you have to get the tank technologies, green finance, green credit, so whatever. Everything is green, but is green only on paper. The fact remains is that until and unless they become a reality, are implemented with sincerity, especially by the developed world, we are looking at more and more meetings with less and less important results.
Mr. Taneja, if I could come back to you, you mentioned that different geographies, different countries will have their own paths to or their own ideas for energy transition. One of the things which the Foreign Secretary Vinay Quatra mentioned yesterday in the briefing ahead of Prime Minister's visit to the UAE was that India was not going to abandon coal for power generation. And the other point that I would like to bring up here is how the European Union President Ursula von der Leyen just hours ago talked about putting a tax on carbon. How do you look at both these developments?
If you dig a bit deeper, until as recent as 8 years ago, majority of leaders from the western part of the world, whenever they talked about climate, they said climate and energy are two sides of the same coin. And in fact, the often repeated kind of the line was that energy security and climate security are two sides of the same coin together. They don't do it anymore. They stopped doing that because that's probably not in their interest, in their national interest. But the question is for India, energy security or energy and climate are two sides of the same coin. And for majority of countries, 82%, globally still come from fossil fuels. It's a fact. We have 3 billion people on the planet who are suffering from energy poverty, including 700 million in South Asia. Now, the question is that in such a kind of environment, in such kind of scenario, if you talk of carbon tax, I think either you're not aware of the ground reality in the global south, particularly, or you are deliberately ignoring it. Now, when it comes to the global agenda, whether for climate or for energy security, or for that matter, for any other issue, all these narratives are written, authored in the global north and disseminated by them. And they look upon them as a kind of a global thing that the global south must accept. But look, the world has changed. We got to understand. For instance, when whatever happened over Ukraine, or commodity prices went up, India was among the countries which actually had to pay very, very billions of dollars every month extra for buying fuels. When we look at our imports, you talked about, when you look at India's energy security, we import 86% of our requirement of oil. We import 56% of our requirement of natural gas. We import roughly 85% of equipment and cells we need for renewables, mainly solar. When it comes to uranium for atomic, again, we import quite substantially. The only source of fuel which kind of helps us in securing energy security or make sure that it's domestically available resource and we can depend on it 100% for energy security, that is coal. So coal is the backbone of India's energy security and therefore, of course, for climate security for us. Now, how can we abandon coal? At the same time, the same country which are lecturing global south in countries like India or even China, they are also consuming oil. Germany has started importing more coal, and countries in the global north have started now reworking their coal policy. So I think we all need to, when I say geography, we are with the world. There can be a global governance for climate, but you cannot have an effective global governance for climate unless and until you also build a kind of global governance for energy. There is no global governance for energy. There is no mechanism for that. There is no body under the UN for energy. But then you want to put a kind of global government for climate. How is that going to work? If you want to do that, welcome, we must do it because it's a huge challenge. But at the same time, it has to be flexible enough for each country or participating in COP that they are free to design their own pathway and actually decide the pace of how they want to carry out the energy transition. For some countries like Norway and Germany, they may need another 5-7 years or maybe less. But for developing economies like India, we need much more time, hopefully by 2070. But I think we have to be very clear. If it takes longer, it takes longer. If we can do it before, we can do it before. So we have to be very clear. India today is in a position economically powerful enough, diplomatically powerful enough, and there are other countries in the global south. We all need to join the forces. We all need to go for two things. Number one, all global narratives on issues like climate, like energy, these had to be written, authored, disseminated together. They cannot be the kind of only kind of the global north thing. We have to work on it. Number two, that when it comes to there seems to be kind of communication gap, information. We need to engage with the global north and put the reality in front of them. Right now, what happens, they talk whatever they want and they expect global south to just kind of follow them. That era, that has changed. If you look at our prime minister's speeches in different forums, in different platforms, whether in G7, our prime minister is very clear. Our prime minister today is the most powerful voice globally on these issues. That's why global south is always looking up. Global south is looking up to New Delhi to not only to guide, but also to lead. And that's what precisely prime minister did today.
Ambassador Trigunyat, if I could ask you, you mentioned the pledges which were made for climate to lessen the impact of climate, the damage that climate crisis brings about. And the pledge, I think, or the promise which was made in Copenhagen was $100 billion by 2020. I think that was the number. Yesterday, there was an announcement, or even today, there was an announcement of an agreement on loss and damage. And over 420 million in pledges have been made. If you look at the G20 New Delhi Declaration, it talks about trillions rather than billions. Now, if the pledge of billions have not been kept, where are we going to find the trillions coming from?
Well, that is the predicament and the paradox of this all. Frankly, the countries that have polluted the world and the polluter pays principle is not applied to them. And they are shirking from their responsibility. This $100 billion was supposed to be every year, not once. And therefore, where we are today, the countries which are in the global south, especially suffering a great deal from the impact of the climate, are not able to have technologies. Same way, green technologies are not made available easily. So until and unless you have some kind of fund of the global reservoir of green technologies, which should be freely available to various countries rather than being bound by those IPR issues and the kind of heft it provides to various countries, it will be very difficult to really implement this. Likewise, Prime Minister has again mentioned today that there have to be finance, so there has to be not billions but trillions are required. Now, of course, these are requirements. The world at this stage, which is mired into the war, and I say, if you come look at the war, how many billions and billions, or rather $1 trillion, have been pumped into this Ukrainian war? Infectious war, which has brought the world into a very different kind of scenario. Now, there they are pumping in arms ammunition because that serves their purpose, that serves their interest groups, whether it's military industrial complex or otherwise, or their geopolitical ambitions. So as long as they don't think that this is an existential crisis for us, I'm sure that they will continue on the destructive path that they have there. But that's where the meetings like COP28 bring about everyone, sets out targets. Now this fund which has been set up, which was in COP27 at Sharm el-Sheikh, which was agreed to loss and damage fund, it has its history, but it is supposed to provide assistance and some support to these poor countries. India is already providing projects or doing projects in various countries in the small island states and others. In 13 or so, Prime Minister mentioned about that. He also spoke about the green credit now. Now, of course, G20, there were several papers that were presented. There was a proposal whether we can have the cross-border transaction tax and the funding from there could go for these kind of climate change. So the alternate working methods are being worked out, but at the same time, what is most important in my view is the political commitment of the major powers. The global community must come together. They are here, 140 countries, with the absence of the two biggest polluting countries' leaders at this, which speaks for. We have seen during President Trump's time, he walked out of this climate thing. Now, these are the kind of things does not give you a great confidence in that. But at the same time, since the pivot is moving towards the global south, countries like India and China are the biggest economies, are going to be the biggest economies over time. I think that their voice is becoming heard. India's voice, as Prime Minister Modi, is loud and clear, and he was very straightforward while telling what India is already doing, advancing its goals, doing it much before 9 years, 11 years, those kind of figures he gave for various self-imposed goals. We have made it goals for ourselves and achieving that. And that's what he has urged the countries, that whatever nationally determined goals you have for these carbon emissions, you must meet them sincerely. So once countries start doing that, then perhaps you can keep the target of 1.5 degree warming, which is there. Otherwise, we are sitting on a time bomb.
Ambassador Chegunyat, you mentioned green credits. And from the Prime Minister's speech, I understand that it is the idea behind it is that of a carbon sink, which you create. And he also spoke about Jan Bhagidari, or people's participation in this process. Would you like to comment on this? What is your understanding on how it works? And Mr. Taneja, if you could come in after this on the green credits thing as well.
Well, I think that this is as a principle. So far, we've been talking of carbon credits, carbon exchange, carbon marketing mechanisms, and all those. Now it has been taken from that into the sink process, which is, in my view, is what the whole idea is about. Plus, also it is also looking at certain wastelands or plantations or some other areas where the credits could be considered while you're doing something greening, rather than not reducing simply the carbons in this. So that's the procedure that's going on. It is also through the decarbonization process. So everything that you do, he tried to explain a little bit, but I think this is already being implemented in India in certain ways. And that is working now, just recently started. But we have to see how it goes up. So this will also blend into the kind of green mechanisms we are talking about, whether it's green finance. And I think that this is one of the mediums. But as I said, is that anything that we are processing, what we are proposing, needs to be accepted and then carried forward and implemented. Fortunately, or whether it's climate change, whether it's green credits or climate justice or climate finance, I think all those three ideas that Prime Minister had laid out are being discussed very sincerely and seriously, and hopefully they will be helping the rest of the world.
Mr. Taneja?
I mean, if you see carefully whether green, you talk of credit mechanism, you talk of sink mechanism, or you talk of several other similar mechanisms, I think these are kind of work better, effective in more kind of sophisticated environment. But there are many countries in the global south which may not be as sophisticated as, for instance, India or China or some developed countries. I think we have to be very clear that when we meet in platforms like in forums like COP and others, it's important that we keep our focus on the one hand and how can we really fight global warming, and at the same time, how can we ensure that we have affordable access to all sources of energy, including traditional sources. I think to talk about anything of climate or any dimension of climate without talking of energy does not really serve the interest of the developing countries or the global south. And if you look at the strategy of the global north, they basically talk about all these things except energy. Now, the question is that for economies like ours or economies even like China, Indonesia, Bangladesh, Nigeria, most of Africa, most of Latin America, or even Middle East for that matter, all these countries. The question is that without energy, 80% countries, 6.7 billion people, they have no future. I really honestly do not understand that how can we really realize or get to the goals in terms of COP, the process, without addressing the energy issue. Now, the question is that, let me give you an example of India, Indonesia, and China. For instance, here, this is all fine that we go for decarbonization, we go for carbon capture, we go for carbon sink, we go for carbon credit, and all these matters are fine. But the question is that we would still have large number of people living below energy poverty line, 3 billion people. And when we go to the market, most of these markets are in the global north, to buy technology for decarbonization, to buy technology for green coal, to buy technology for green exploration production of gas, or green exploration production of oil, or for that matter, coal. I mean, these technologies are very, very expensive. That's where we need to address. I mean, this has to be part of the process and the dialogue. That when it comes to technology, it's so expensive that majority of countries find very difficult to buy it from you guys, the so-called global north. Now, that is what we need to address. Why their focus is only on this thing, you buy this technology, you get this carbon, this thing, your process, you set up. We all have done that. India also set up a mechanism for carbon market and everything. We are doing that. Majority of countries are doing that. But my sense is, looking at the size of people who suffer from energy poverty, and looking at the kind of requirement we have for energy for years to come, economies like India, I think that we need to have kind of our focus in a more balanced manner. 50% focus on energy, 50% on climate. Only then we'll get where we need to get. But the narratives of all these things, as I said repeatedly, with all due respect, set by Global North, are basically all these things we have to be very, very careful. We have to participate in building these narratives, and these narratives have to be such which are 50-50 energy and climate. And unless and until we do that, we can have 100 rounds of COP. I don't really think that is going to help the climate or, for that matter, eradication of energy poverty.
Mr. Taneja, staying with you, I'd like to ask, you talked about access. Now, the point I'd like to bring up here is, the Prime Minister in his speech spoke about access of technology for meeting the challenges posed by the climate crisis. The access is a major issue for countries of the global south, right? And if the technologies are not available, the transition is not going to happen. So what are your thoughts on this?
I mean, there are two issues here. Number one, access to technology. There are many technology which is being denied to countries of the global south for whatever reasons, because they see some defense dimension in that technology or whatever it is. The second thing is capital to access the technology. You face China also at both the fronts. When you go to access capital from Western market, because majority of capital that's where it is, then we find that the interest they talk about and the terms and conditions are such that most countries find very difficult to accept them. Even when you do, and you're kind of connected with the technology that you want to buy, there are many issues. And again, you face China wall. So I think those are the issues that need to be addressed. That there they want to do everything strictly commercially. They say, oh, we are government, these are private banks, these are private companies, these are private research and development organizations, you go and talk to them. And as a developing country, you go to them, they ask for the moon. How do we do that? And at the same time, when you come to COP summit, political leaders, they say, hey, technology is available, why don't you do it? So these are commercial interests that they're promoting at the same time. We all understand that. But the point is that if you are doing that, if there is a kind of corporate greed, and at the same time, you want the global south or the 6.7 billion people to kind of buy at the same commercially, I think it's not working. What we need to do is, together with COP summits and all that, we need to set up labs across global south or even in the global north, where they will work on research and development for climate technology, and the technology is available for free or for a very nominal cost. so that the global south countries can buy. Right now, all technology which are available for in terms of for green coal or green exploration product, these are very expensive technology, and the technology, even the implementation, even the people who specialize in these things, they're all coming from the global north, and they all ask for the moon. Now, those are the challenges. They are commercial in nature, but that's where basically the trouble lies.
Ambassador Trigunyat, India has made several proposals. For example, not proposals, it's actually come up with some solutions. For example, the International Solar Alliance. Then we've proposed as a country, India has proposed climate resilient infrastructure. We had some ideas, plans for the small island states, which we unveiled in Glasgow. How does this help India burnish its credentials as a country which has problems, yes, but solutions as well for climate change or the climate crisis?
Yeah, you have absolutely bang on when you say that the country has some problems, but it has solutions as well, and has global solutions. Because, say, after a very long time, India really came up with very important initiative, a multilateral initiative, which is International Solar Alliance in 2015. And thereafter, now we have seen the CDRI, you mentioned about it. Then you have now this year in G20. Another important initiative was Global Biofuel Alliance. Now hydrogen mission and all those kind of things that India is doing in a very big way. Now it is doing in a big way because it requires energy, green energy, in a very big way. If it has to grow at 7-8% rates of growth and be the second or third largest economy. So it is very important from our perspective. While doing so, what India is doing is that it is setting examples at the very large scale. If having the largest population in the world that you are applying, be it Ujjwala scheme, be it the LEDs, be it the ISA, solar power energy, renewable energy, those targets are gigantic. And that's why there is a greater respect. Apart from a strategic pivot, India has also emerging as a model country in terms of very laudable initiatives, which are implementable, because first we have done sort of a lab in India where we have applied and implemented these. And now we are telling the world, you want to have it, please do. And very often, many of the things we are providing for free. I mean, in fact, without any this thing to the global south countries, that India has shown it to the world. So I think that one of the things that has to be that global south, because we have seen now for umpteen number of years, decades have passed by, that the global north has its own designs. They can pump in money for wars, for the geopolitical ambitions, but for real things, they are not so keen. So we have to develop into a new kind of a paradigm as far as the global south is concerned, which India is trying to do very well actually. Emerging Prime Minister Modi's focus on 2 global south summits is a very important initiative, which says clearly that what are our priorities and how we want to do that. And that's the reason India continues to emphasize on common and differentiated responsibilities in this area. And therefore, we have to develop our own energies, our own new paradigms, a new cooperation, collaboration, transfer of technologies and all, while working trying to use our leverage with the global north or the other countries, in the major countries in the world, trying to create some kind of a CSR initiative on their part as far as the technology transfer is concerned. For the finance, I think there are discussions in the G20 also. There were discussions whether some kind of a global transaction tax could be applied and which can be used then. Funds can be used for this purpose, and let us see how these are implemented. But loss and damage fund has been created, very small amount, but it's a good beginning.
So basically, your verdict is that a good beginning has been made at COP28. There are issues like, for example, what Mr. Taneja raised about a global governance, climate governance system not being there, which hampers the governance system. So we would need to conclude here. Thank you both, Mr. Taneja, as well as Ambassador Trigunyat, for joining this discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
You were listening to a discussion on COP28 Ways to Mitigate Climate Change. The participants were Narendra Taneja, energy expert, Anil Trigunyat, former diplomat, and Elizabeth Roche, associate professor. This program was produced and presented by the News Services Division of Akashvani. You can listen to it on our mobile app, News on AIR. This program is also available on our YouTube channel, News on AIR Official. You may share your feedback about this program through email at airnsdtalks@gmail.com or through WhatsApp on 9289094044.